Let me know. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Adventures in the Everglades. We're joined with our host, Mark Bolgiano, local adventure enthusiast who spent quite a bit of his time hiking, biking, canoeing, and camping, lots of outdoorsy activities. So please remain muted for the presentation, and there will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end. So Mark, whenever you're ready, I will go ahead and full screen this, and
Thanks.
I'm going to push play.
This is a story about four guys who paddled their four canoes 150 miles on a 2-week journey across the Florida Everglades from January 1st to January 14th, 2023. I was lucky enough to be one of those guys in the story. It was the experience of a lifetime, unlike anything I've ever done before. It was a journey that left me with a whole new appreciation for this beautiful planet we live on. It wasn't just the place either. It was the people, the three people that I shared the experience with that made it so great. Now, it all started with Robert Patch, the trip's instigator and organizer. Robert and I first met in 1964 at a swimming pool that my dad, a Montgomery County public school teacher, managed during summers. We were 8 years old. Robert was a precocious kid and had already made his mark on the world with a listing in the Guinness Book of Records as the world's youngest inventor, having patented a toy that could be transformed into different kinds of trucks at age 6. Robert and I were best friends into high school, even though we lived at opposite ends of the county. But we lost track of each other for about 50 years until we crossed paths on a canoeing Facebook group about a year ago. Robert recently retired after selling the roofing contractor business he started and was recovering from back surgery when he asked me if I was interested in an Everglades canoeing trip he was organizing. Robert had chosen an ambitious route. It zigzagged into more remote and more challenging parts of the Everglades rather than following the straighter and easier wilderness waterway, a well-marked 99-mile water trail, and a passage that about 100 people a year complete. Robert also recruited his friend Joe Haig to join the group. Now, the Potomac River is home to me, almost like a mother. I love her dearly and visit her often. In that sense, Joe's a brother I'd never met before, because he has a very special bond with that Potomac River, too. Many people know him as Towpath Joe. He retired a year ago after 20 years as the caretaker and only resident of Sycamore Island, which lies in the middle of the Potomac inside the Beltway and just 2 miles upriver from the city of Washington, D.C. The towpath in his nickname refers to the trail that runs along the canal, the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, and the Potomac River, 185 miles from Cumberland to Georgetown in D.C. And Joe's one of the few people I know to have ever paddled a canoe down that 185-mile stretch in a single trip down the Potomac River. He's a bit of a local legend as a musician, a naturalist, and an advocate. And he's sort of a diplomat for the Potomac River. You can even watch a documentary about him made, and I think it's available on YouTube. Chad Gillis, unlike the rest of us native Maryland boys, is a local. He lives near the Everglades. He's also the only one among us who was not AARP eligible, although I believe he will be next year. Chad spends a lot of his time in the Everglades, but he never found anyone willing to paddle the whole thing with him until he connected with Robert via the same canoeing Facebook group that I found him on. His knowledge of this wilderness, its ecosystem, wildlife, history, and his extensive experience canoeing on its waters really enriched the trip. Now, for 20 years, Chad has been writing about environmental issues in the Everglades for the Gannett newspaper chain. He's an influential advocate for preserving the Everglades, a gifted musician, an expert fisherman, and the winner of several regional canoe racing competitions. These three guys were very experienced and knowledgeable when it came to canoes, paddling, and wilderness camping. I was, by far, the rookie of the group. But I had done about 30 multi day hiking, biking, paddling, and wilderness camping trips since retiring 3 years ago. In many ways, we were an unlikely group of strangers. Before we started, Chad hadn't met any of us in person, and I hadn't seen Robert for 50 years until he proposed the trip last summer. Only Robert and Joe were the only ones previously acquainted before the trip. And yet, when we first met at the Everglades National Park campground in Flamingo on New Year's Day to begin our journey, we really clicked as friends and as a team. Now, I've been part of, and led great teams in my professional career, but this was different. This was really, really different. We had to depend on each other in ways that affected our lives and safety. What happened to one of us basically happened to all of us. So we took care of each other, encouraged each other, and made good decisions together. We had many hours of conversations between two of us, three of us, or all four of us, paddling on the water and at camp. We shared our stories, our food, our water, our gear, as well as the awe and wonder that the Everglades inspire. For 2 weeks, it was basically just the four of us, except for the rare encounters with no more than 7 or 8 other paddlers the whole time, and even fewer fishermen in the occasional powerboat. The middle 4 days of the trip, we didn't see another human being. The inevitable problems and frustrations we encountered every day, many that might have ruined the trip for many, were handled as a group with cool heads, competence, and good humor. We got along extremely well. These guys taught me as much during the preparation and planning phase as I learned during the trip itself. We all had a healthy respect for this gigantic watery wilderness and the hazards it held for the unprepared. Robert led the planning masterfully. We used a group text that had started months before where we discussed and planned everything from basics like food, water, clothing, shelter, to serious safety matters, the weather, tides, satellite phones, and even emergency helicopter evacuation insurance. So when we arrived at the Everglades Park on New Year's Day, the trip was well planned and we were well prepared and equipped for it. Of course, nothing could have possibly prepared us for the place itself. The largest American wilderness east of the Mississippi. That's what the Everglades are. It is huge. It's a little bigger than the state of Connecticut. And unspoiled by roads, cell coverage, or any structures other than those related to the few remote designated national park wilderness campsites that we had to get permits for because the Park Service strictly limits the number of people who can be at those sites and in this huge park at any given time. Now, the Everglades is essentially a slow and shallow river 100 miles wide that runs over and through porous limestone of southern Florida that is so saturated and so flat that water barely flows at all. It moves downstream at only 50 feet an hour. There's almost no land or dry ground anywhere, only the mangrove trees in the water that give the illusion of island, channel, lake, or shore, when actually it's just one big body of water, rarely deeper than 4 or 5 feet. The Everglades are a snapshot, too, in a slow motion process of the seas rising when the planet gets warmer and receding during the ice ages. It also reflects more recent human attempts to adapt to and, or in their folly, resist this ancient cycle. Sea levels, and thus the Everglades, haven't really changed that much in the last 5,000 years. But when the first humans arrived there during the last ice age, about 14,000 years ago, they settled on a shoreline that is now submerged under the waters of the Gulf, 100 miles offshore from where they are now. And it was basically a desert at that time. At the center of the story, and the Florida Peninsula itself, is Lake Okeechobee, a triangular lake with 30-mile sides. If you think of it as a big bathtub with the Kissimmee River watershed pouring water through into the bathtub, uh, during the rainy season, the Okeechobee Lake bathtub overflows its southern edge, and it spreads over the flat floor in all directions to the Atlantic on the right, the Gulf of Mexico on the left, and down to the Bay of Florida and the Keys below. The two blue arrows in the diagram pointing to the right are water flows channelized over the last century, with drainage canals to make the land dry and habitable for expanding population centers on the east coast of Florida like Miami. These and other drainage projects, dams, canals, and pumping stations in other parts of the Everglades, in an attempt to expand agriculture and economic development, were disastrous for the Everglades ecosystem and Florida's water supply, water quality. But thanks to dedicated environmental advocates like Chad, this beautiful place is now moving back towards sustainability. The big blue area below Lake Okeechobee is the Everglades water moving slowly over the flat, porous limestone, recharging aquifers and replenishing the only source of fresh water for 7 million South Floridians. The five blue arrows at the bottom cover roughly the location of Everglades National Park, and our route corresponds very roughly with the tips of those five arrows, about 150 miles. It's a world made of two things: endless water and mangrove trees, and really, above the surface, little else. At times, every place we went, to some extent, looked exactly like every other place we'd been that day. The random intersections of channels, the lakes with multiple entry and exit points, and the narrow congested passages reminded me of traffic circles, diagonal streets, and alleys of my native Washington, D.C. I can't imagine attempting this trip without a GPS. But with our GPS and good maps, we paddled in the open sea around Florida's capes, across broad bays, up wide rivers into the interior, through a maze of channels, and inland far enough to need to bushwhack and cut our way through narrow tree-choked passages about as far inland as the canoe could go. And of course, the water kept going all the way upstream to Lake Okeechobee. The water is everywhere. It's in the air, which is barely drier than the water, and the semi-liquid mud at the bottom, which could be more dangerous than the water above it. Wet clothes hanging in the sun and the wind never seemed to get completely dry, and the morning dews left the outside of our tents and anything else we left outside soaked as if it had rained all night. But the weather was spectacular. 70 to 80 degrees every day, sunny, with nights in the mid 60s. I wore shorts and t-shirts the whole time until a cold front came through in the last 24 hours and reminded me that it was, in fact, after all, early January. The Everglades were different from any place I've ever been. Being immersed in something so big and serene and so mysterious, really, over so many days, it's hard to describe, but wonderful to experience. So I just flew in from the West Coast, and boy, are my arms tired. This corny old joke kept coming to mind for days after the trip was over, and boy, were my arms tired for real. The 12 days I spent paddling across the Everglades was by far the hardest I've ever pushed my body. It felt good to float between the water and the sky under the warm sun, always pushing forward, riding or fighting the wind, the wave, tidal currents, burning on average about 750 calories an hour. But all that physical exertion was made a lot easier by the fact that after we started, there really wasn't any other choice. You had to push forward for the entire distance to the end. There weren't any roads or access points in between where we started on day 1 and where we finished on day 12. There's also no fresh water sources between the start and the finish line. So, in addition to about 100 pounds of food, clothes, and gear, we each started carrying another 100 pounds in our canoe of water for drinking and cooking for the 12 days. We put the canoes in at the marina at the national park in Flamingo. After camping for a couple of nights at the campground there, while Robert, Joe, and Chad shuttled canoes and people and cars to our starting point, um, and made sure there was a car at our final destination in Chokoloskee, which was a 6-hour round trip drive away from the campground. Where I stayed, minding our gear and canoes, um, hanging out in the campground. It was hard work, but I seemed to manage. Now, after setting out from the marina in Flamingo, our days followed a pretty consistent routine. We started emerging from our tents at daybreak between 6 and 7 in the morning, break camp, and start packing up as Robert prepared coffee and oatmeal pancakes for all of us. I took on the job of scullery maid and cleaned the pots, pans, and dishes at the water's edge every morning after breakfast. Very wary of any large reptilian friends who might find my hands a tempting breakfast treat. We carefully loaded gear and ourselves into our canoes, which, from a high chickee platform or a dock above the water, could be a lot more difficult than it sounds. But we did it without any major mishaps and usually got back on the water shortly after sunrise, around 7. We paddled about 10 miles each day, which usually took 6 to 7 hours, including a couple of short breaks in places sheltered from the wind or the waves or the current. Otherwise, if you took a break from paddling, it could mean losing a lot of ground. Since there was no dry land anywhere, we stayed in our canoes the whole day until we reached the next campsite. By the time we reached the campsite, unloaded, secured the canoes, made camp, and finished dinner, the sun was going down and we were all pretty ready to get into our tents and go to sleep, around 7 or 8 p.m. This left almost no time for leisure, although we had a couple of evenings where we had the time to relax, fish, build a driftwood campfire on the beach for an extra hour or two before we went to sleep. Now, the first 3 days we spent paddling our canoes in the Gulf of Mexico around the southern tip of Florida and the southern tip of the continental U.S. for that matter, around Cape Sable, which bulges westward into the Gulf of Mexico. We originally planned to paddle from north to south, but reversed the route to paddle with, rather than against, the usual prevailing winds out of the southwest in our first few days. This turned out to be a good decision because we started our trip paddling off the Florida coast with the wind at our backs and with a strong cross chop from powerful swells that were rolling in at a right angle to the wind from the open sea on our left toward the Florida coast on our right. The swells constantly pushed our canoes to go parallel to them, which can be very dangerous in a canoe. You don't want to take waves broadside or you really risk being flipped over. Keeping the canoe pointed in the right direction took about as much effort, and maybe more, as moving forward. These conditions demanded an incredibly intense focus on the water, wind, and waves every second, and nothing else. We didn't take pictures, we didn't have conversations while rounding the capes, except when we took a few breaks near the coastline in the mangroves that offered protection from the waves. Now, once I got used to open sea canoeing, which I'd never done before, I started to take short tacks out to sea, crossing the swells safely at an angle, and then turning for longer tacks back toward the coast, paddling fast enough to catch a swell and surf on it, letting it do most of the work. Our landmarks, this part of the trip, were the sandy capes that stuck out into the Gulf. After canoeing on the Potomac and other winding rivers back home, it seemed odd to paddle for hours on end in such a huge body of water with one's destination in sight the whole time. The first 2 nights we camped on lonely, unspoiled beaches on these capes. The canoes needed to be unloaded from all the gear to pull the canoes up on the beach, and we always had to be very mindful of the tides. One night we pulled the canoes up about 30 feet from the water's edge at low tide and woke up to find water lapping very close to our canoes and campsites in the morning. Another night we pulled the canoes up at high tide, only to find when we woke up that we were 100 yards of mud flats from the water. And we had a long walk carrying canoes and gear to water deep enough to paddle in. On the third day, we turned inland at the mouth of the Shark River, which turned out to be aptly named. Seeing that first bull shark swimming slowly under my canoe gave me a start. But they never seemed to be very interested in us. This is also where we started seeing alligators and the first of many manatees, which we actually considered much more of a threat because manatees can't see or hear very well, and if you surprise them, bump up against them, it could be disastrous. They weigh a half ton to a ton, and these gentle giants could easily capsize a canoe with a flip of the tail. After a while, I got used to the large shadowy forms passing beneath me in the waters that were usually 4 or 5 feet deep and rarely went deeper than 9 or 10 feet. We went several miles inland on the Shark River, alternatively riding and fighting a strong current as the tide changed, until we reached the broad Oyster Bay estuary. And our first night camping above the water on an open-air platforms known by their seminal name, chickies. Chickies could be challenging. Loading and unloading gear was tricky, and there wasn't a lot of room. It was very close quarters for setting up 4 tents. Tides and currents could trap a canoe under the platform. As Robert found out when he was awakened by noise that turned out to be his canoe trapped under the platform in the middle of the night. It could also damage a canoe pushed by the force of current and wind up against the platform's pilings and barnacles, which I found out the next morning. No serious damage, but a few nice scratches. The 1 inch gaps between the floorboards were the real hazard, though, and these gaps claimed several small, narrow items of our gear, including a tent pole. But the chickies were also a really pleasant and unique place to spend the night. Out over the water with a nice vantage point to see sunrises and sunsets and many kinds of fish and wading birds. Once we had turned inland into the brackish water of the rivers and bays where fresh water of the Everglades meets the salt water of the Gulf, there was really no dry land anywhere for miles, only the mangroves in the water. Capsizing a canoe here could be very problematic. The next day, we continued inland through a maze of confusing interconnected channels, lakes, and bays until we reached a campsite on a rare piece of dry land, a ground site called Cane Patch. Now, it was on an island that wasn't a natural one, but a completely man-made one. The island was created by the Calusa tribe thousands of years ago, using shells from centuries of oyster dinners. Hundreds lived on these mounds, which they built up higher and higher to keep up with a steadily rising sea level, about an inch every 3 years, starting at the end of the last ice age up to the present day. It was the first of 3 man-made islands built by the Calusa that we camped on in the inland part of our trip, where the channels became narrow and clogged with living and fallen mangrove trees that were underwater, barely under the surface or at the surface or hanging close over the water. We were definitely off the beaten path, pushing the limits of where a canoe could get through, scooching our heavily loaded canoes over barely submerged logs, doing the limbo under low-lying horizontal branches, and many times using handsaws to cut fallen trees that blocked our way. On our 7th day, we spent 17 hours on the water, stuck in a so-called river that was choked with mangrove trunks and branches of all sizes that we had to cut through before making it to our campsite at 2 a.m. We zigged and zagged, crossing the wilderness waterway several times as we headed back towards the Gulf into the wider rivers and bays, and then back inland a second time before returning to the open seas along the Gulf Coast closer to our destination. We camped on the beaches of small islands or keys there for 2 nights before turning back inland for our final destination, which was Chokoloskee Island, a national park center at the northern edge of the park. Now, up to that point, we'd enjoyed 10 days in a row of sometimes windy but absolutely beautiful and mild weather. On the 10th night, however, the NOAA weather broadcast we got over the satellite warned of a cold front coming through, bringing high winds, rain, and a more than 20-degree temperature drop overnight. We decided that we would leave early the next day and try to get to our final campsite of the trip before the cold front did. We got up around 4:30 a.m. and left camp and paddled in the dark for the first hour or two as we left the Gulf Coast one last time and paddled with some urgency inland into the bays and rivers as we watched dark clouds on the northern horizon. We made it to our chickie just in time, around noon, about 15 minutes before the winds and the rain hit. We'd quickly pulled the 4 canoes onto the platform with us rather than mooring them to the chickie itself, where high winds and current might do serious damage if we left them on the water. After that, we put on our rain gear. We hunkered down as the rain and wind blew in, and we took the afternoon off. By nightfall, the rain had stopped, but the wind and the cold behind the front remained, making our last night in the Everglades a pretty chilly one. But a silver flask of Southern Comfort was brought out and passed around, and as we considered one last group decision we'd have to make, talked about the trip, and that was almost over. But the next morning we did have a decision to make, and it was brought on by the cold front's change in the weather. We only had a few miles left, but the last mile across Chokoloskee Bay to the marina on the island where our cars waited would be really risky in the high winds. The low temperatures, combined with the winds and waves working against us and blowing offshore away from land and out to sea, would not only make a capsize a lot more likely, it could make the consequences potentially life-threatening. We could wait it out until the winds died down, but according to NOAA, that might be a 2 or 3 day wait. So we decided to go for it, taking a longer but more sheltered inland river route that we timed with the tides, and we minimized the time and distance we'd have paddling across the bay at the very end across rough seas. We left the chickie bundled up against the cold. I had 4 layers on under my rain jacket and rain pants, knowing that the only thing worse than being cold was being cold and wet. The 12th day in a row of paddling was really starting to take a toll on all of us. It certainly was on me, and it felt like we were going in slow motion, especially that last half mile crossing the bay through whitecaps. That was by far the hardest paddling of the trip, and it pushed me right up to the limits of my strength and endurance. It took me an hour and almost everything I had, fighting fierce headwinds and digging really hard for every inch, to go a distance that would usually only take me 10 or 15 minutes. But eventually I made it safely to the takeout point and the car, and won this last round in my battle against the elements. But I think not by much. Soon we were loading our gear in canoes, saying our goodbyes, and celebrating our success with a final group picture. At 66 years old, an age where I'm learning the importance of knowing, respecting, and living with my physical limitations, this experience taught me that I'm capable of a lot more than I thought I was. Had I known how hard it would be, I'm not sure I would have decided to go on this adventure at all. But now that I've done it, I can say that I'm really, really glad I decided to take the chance and paddle across the Everglades with Robert, Joe, and Chad.
Okay.
Well, that sounds like quite a trip.
It's a lot of fun.
All right. So, any questions from anyone?
You mentioned satellite radio. Did you have a satellite phone with you as well?
We did. Yeah, all the loved ones got a sort of we're alive and at the right destination message every night. We
That's
used
good.
to do texting. Yeah, that's that was par for the course for these guys. They really knew what they were doing. This was something very new for me. I mean, I've gone without signal in the Paw section of the river or something, but this is a whole different game.
Incredible.
Did you have any run-ins with alligators? That's what I would
Not
be
run-ins,
scared about.
I was really surprised how used to paddling my canoe close to alligators I got. They all ignored us pretty much, and they're not known to attack. But when we were just starting on the second time going back inland, still in the saltwater, we saw something that we were told, and Chad, really familiar with the place, said it was very rare to see. We got to see an American crocodile, and they are aggressive, and and it was very shallow. It was like 2 or 3 feet deep, and it did not ignore us when it saw us coming down the channel. It just slid right into the water. We didn't see it again, but I think it was just an optimistic crocodile.
Regarding the environment, you mentioned a number of times that limestone aquifer that runs kind of the length of the state. I had read some years ago that one of the issues all the way downstream, as it were, was the large number of cattle upstate, and that the cattle waste was percolating down. Is that still an issue, do you know, or is it being managed?
Well, I probably don't have enough knowledge to speak to it. I happen to have been an ag major at Maryland, plants, not animals. But as a general fact, I can tell you that kind of contamination only happens when you're talking about operations like they have in Texas and Kansas, where there's thousands and thousands and thousands of cattle. Because it's it's not a like a pesticide or
Right.
I certainly wouldn't want to drink from the stream, nearby. I think the real big hazard, for the 7 million people that depend on the Everglades for their fresh water, is that, and I think that we've narrowly avoided it. But when all of Miami used to be like this, all of Fort Lauderdale and Palm Beach used to be like this. But what they did is they dug canals that drained the water out so that they could build on dry land.
Right.
But when you do that, it's not some mystical balance you're messing up. The fact is, if you're redirecting fresh water from one place, salt water will invade. And if the saltwater invasion of the aquifer reaches a certain point, it's going to be really, really bad news. They can't dig a well in Florida. There's only one source of the water, and it's the aquifer under the Everglades.
Right.
And Chad's a real activist around this issue. He's probably one of the most knowledgeable people about water, both policy and science, in Southwest Florida. We had some great conversations.
I changed the subject a little bit. Did you see birds? What kind of birds did you see while you were paddling?
Oh my gosh. Well, on the coast, we saw a whole different set of birds than we saw in the interior, the inland. Inland it was all wading birds, snowy egrets and herons, and lots of species of both egrets and herons that I'd never seen, around home. One bird that I saw that I thought was commonplace, but Chad couldn't wait to. He's a newspaper guy, to talk to his contact at the State Department of Natural Resources or something, was a bird that hadn't been sighted in Florida for years, and it's the flamingo.
Oh, yeah.
It's not native to Florida. It's native to the Caribbean. And I don't know if they had flamingos there before. I know it's associated with Florida, but we were at the cane patch, which is that Calusa mound, artificial island, which for the last 100 years before they built the park was a homestead of a non-Native American person. So there was a break in the canopy, and we looked up at sunset and saw 3 flamingo fly right over us, lit up by the low sun. You could see the pink color, like it was digitally enhanced. It was unbelievable. We also, our 17 hours, I'm sure we cut through several hundred trees to get out of this Wood River where we got stuck. We were, it was about 11 o'clock at night. We still had many miles to go through all this mangrove mess. And we heard a sound ahead. And Chad, who knows the wildlife really well, was pretty sure that it was a Florida panther having a fight with a raccoon or something. And it was the most horrible screaming sound. It was really loud, and it was straight ahead. And as we got closer, we realized that in the canopy, in the mangrove over the water we were canoeing through, was a snowy egret rookery of it had to have been 10,000 birds. And that's why it was so loud. And they were freaking out about our LED headlamps. And they were not happy. They dive bombed us. We were literally holding up our paddles in front of our face so the bird wouldn't hit our face.
Whoa.
They were flying at us because a lot of them left right away. But then we figured out that the 10% that stayed were guarding nests. And I mean, I don't know if you've ever been in a hen house, but it was just like walking through my grandparents' hen house. Feathers everywhere and the smell, and just thousands of birds.
Very well. Very nice to hear.
But the Chad knew all the species of the birds. I couldn't recount them all to you, but a lot of wading birds, waders and fishers.
Mhm.
And
How are the
also,
mosquitoes?
pardon?
Sorry. How are the mosquitoes?
They weren't bad. We came just a week after a freak cold snap where it went, I think, really close to freezing. And, mosquitoes have a 2-week life cycle. So probably all the larvae in the water got killed by the cold, and we lucked out. In the evening, if there was an offshore breeze, we would sometimes get a half hour or an hour where we'd put on some nets. I used a lot of DEET, for that one period in the evening when the sun was going down, and only at a few places, maybe half the places. But then after that, it cooled down enough in the 60s that you didn't see a whole lot of mosquitoes.
So aside from the last part of the trip that you said was probably the hardest, what were some other really difficult challenges that you guys had to make tough decisions over along the way?
Well, that 17-hour night was our only capsize, where a current caught Robert, and he couldn't get under the branch, and he went upside down.
Oh, wow.
There's literally no solid ground anywhere. But he found a trunk to stand on, reached into his canoe and grabbed some webbing, a strap, and put it over a branch above him, put a loop at the bottom, put his foot in it, bailed out his canoe, and used the stirrup to get back in his canoe. And we were going again in 20 minutes. But the initial splash, I mean, that's a really serious thing. First of all, if you lose your water out of your boat, that's really, really serious. There's no fresh water to drink anywhere. But also, it's night, it's cold. And Chad, of course, who canoes on the Everglades all the time, kept saying, we are breaking the cardinal sin of canoe. You never canoe in the dark in the Everglades. Not a good idea. So we listened to the experts say that for about 6 hours before we got home.
How
So
did you know? I was gonna say, how did you know where suitable camping areas were? Were they mapped, or you?
They're the Park Service. It's a national park, and you are only allowed to camp in those sites, and you have to get a permit. The permits go 90 days in advance. So 90 days before this time period, Robert had already practiced on the website so he could grab all the permits we needed. They only allow, there's less than 50, 60 people in a park the size of Connecticut at any given time, in the wilderness part. At the north and south end where we started and finished, people rent canoes and will go day trips and stuff, but not many people go from the north end to the south end of the national park. Very, very few people. Like I said, we went 4 days without seeing another human being, and I'm sure we didn't see more than 10 people, fishermen and other paddlers, the entire 12 days. It's and actually that's really consistent with the national parks around the country. You have to, if you want to camp in the wilderness, you have to get a permit for specific sites for specific days, and it's legal to camp there otherwise.
So if you have a problem, you got to stay in your canoe.
Pardon?
I said, so if you have a problem and you can't get your campsite, you got to stay in your canoe.
Well, we made sure that we wouldn't have to worry about that eventuality. Plus, we spent all day in the canoe as it was. There was no place to get out and stretch. The entire 7 hours we were in our canoes.
Mark, Mark, I had a question about water and how much you carried and how much would you drink a day?
The rule of thumb is 1 gallon per person per day. I use a lot less than that, but I still brought the quota, and we all contributed some of our water to things, like making the oatmeal and cooking rice and whatever. But that's the rule of thumb that people use unless you're in the desert, and then I think that that amount goes higher.
I have to imagine if any of you gentlemen were stargazers, that the night sky must be incredibly bright.
That's what I was anticipating. I am a stargazer, and the problem is there's so much moisture in the air that even with the total absence of light pollution, there was too much moisture in the air.
Oh my gosh.
Now, after the cold front, it might have been different, but it was still clouded over from the cold front going through our last night on the Chicky. So, and we were back in civilization by the time the next night came.
Oh my.
Yeah, I was really disappointed, actually. I like to take night pictures. Photos.
Mark, did the Park Service check on you while you were in the wilderness area? I mean, how would they have known? Would anyone have known if some disaster had befallen you? I mean, was there checkpoints or
No.
check-ins at all?
No.
Interesting.
But before we could get the permit, we had to give them a lot of information. The
Next
color,
of kin.
blood type, no, color, what kind of canoe, color.
Right, right. Okay.
Plus, we were prepared for an emergency evacuation if we had to
Oh,
do it
yeah. Yeah.
for a medical on our own.
Oh, okay. Got it.
And it's hard to get across just how big this place is.
Oh, yeah. Sounds
The
huge.
idea of someone doing check-ins would go right out the window. I think if you took,
Yeah.
it's hard to,
Right.
it's just.
Well, I
a
didn't
little-
know if near the designated campsites, there were
No,
any kind of check-in stations or something, so they could say, okay, this group made it here, or this one didn't.
no, the
been here for 2
dedicated,
days.
a lot of these sites were really, really remote. So they
Right,
weren't
got it.
accessible, they weren't accessible by boat.
Right, right.
The park service would have to paddle a kayak or a canoe out.
Right. The same as you
And
did.
probably 20 or 30 miles.
Wow. Yeah.
There's no roads for.
No,
100
I get that. Right. Because
yeah.
of the,
So
it's
so
not-
there's no way
there's
to
no
really
land.
operationally, I don't know
Right,
how you would solve
right.
that problem except for
Yeah, I was just
helicopters
curious.
or drones.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah,
All right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, I want to say, Claire, though, that one night when they were paddling through that woody area,
Mangrove, yeah.
that was the only night I was worried. So I called the park
Yeah.
service, but they were closed. Because
Oh, great.
I usually got a text message by
Yeah.
5 p.m. And this
Right.
is the only day that 5, 6, 7, 8,
Yeah.
and nothing happened, no text.
Wow.
So I called the park service, they were closed. I called them the next morning to ask them that question that you just
Yeah.
asked. I don't know where they are. They're supposed to be here. But at 1:30 in the morning, like, got a text saying that they were about to get to their campsite. So that was relief.
Yeah. Wow. That's
We were
interesting. Julie.
fine. We
Thanks.
were fine.
Yeah. Yeah. Very good.
Just
Thank
a
you.
lot of
Mark.
mangrove leaves in the bottom of the canoe.
Yep.
Does anyone else have any questions? Well, that was a really fascinating presentation. Thank you so much for doing this for us.
Well,
Yeah,
I want
thank
to
you,
thank
Mark.
Thank you
you.
for sharing it.
Yeah, I really like the presentation, Mark.
Oh, thank you so much. That means a lot to me. And Kelly, if I could, I want to say thank you and all the volunteers, that I know through some of the activities. Maria and Melissa, Claire, all those folks. I moved here to Poolesville 2 years ago, sort of rebooting my life, and I can't tell you how big a difference Poolesville Seniors has made for my life. It just really made me feel welcome,
Thank
and
you, Mark.
I really, really appreciate it.
Well, we're glad that you're with us and that you're
Yes.
enjoying all the events and stuff like that.
And very,
We
very
may,
happy.
we
to
may
make-
quote you on that.
Aw.
Oh, yeah. I want to testify.
There you go. And thank you, Julie, as well, for your participation with us. So both
Oh,
of you were
sure.
wonderful.
And I've really enjoyed these in the past, especially the local history ones. They're
Yeah.
great,
Yeah.
great stuff.
Right.
All
Hey.
right.
All right. Thanks, you guys.
Thank
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Mark.
Thank
You
you.
have a good evening.
You too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Have a
night.
good night,
Bye.
everyone.
Good night.